Please be advised, Once Upon a Crime is a series depicting true crime incidents in South Africa. The content may not be suitable for sensitive listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The views and opinions expressed during Once Upon a Crime is not that of the SABC and Lotus FM.
The public profile of the victim in today's case brought a lot of attention to the senseless and ever-growing wave of crime in South Africa, and his murder had even international audiences drawn to the issue. Lucky Dube and his celebrity status and his role as a musician was such a big focus at the time of his murder that perhaps his more important roles as a father, as a husband, as a brother, as a friend, and as a partner seemed to be lost in the chaos. Another reason that today's case is particularly important to discuss is that it focuses on what might be considered a very ordinary crime in South Africa, a hijacking. And yet, even in this seemingly clear-cut crime, there are some really fascinating uses of forensics and forensic pathology that helped put the killers behind bars.
Lucky Philip Dube was born on the 3rd of August 1964 in Ermelo, Mpumalanga. He would be raised by a single parent, along with his siblings, Thandi and Mandla. And one of his latest songs, Remember Me, seemed to be dedicated to the father he'd never really known. In Lucky's early years, he says he saw no point in school. He wanted to contribute financially to his household, so he would regularly take long stretches off from school and worked as a gardener. Soon though, he realized that he was not going to get very far in life with a gardener's wage, so he started focusing on his schoolwork again. It would be this decision to return to school that would pave the way for the rest of Lucky's life, as he joined a choir and discovered his musical talents. His first musical group was called the Skyway Band, with some of his schoolmates, and around this time he also became interested in the Rastafari movement, which would influence a lot of his style of music toward reggae eventually. Lucky initially recorded 5 albums of pop music actually with a group called Lucky Dube and the Super Soul, but then he started to release under his own name and he began to dabble in reggae. In 1984, Lucky released a mini album called Rastas Never Die, which became In 1984, Lucky released a mini album called Rastas Never Die, which was banned in South Africa by the apartheid government. This banning led Lucky to become incredibly popular overseas, and by the time he released his next album, his popularity had exploded, both locally and internationally. And he was soon very much the darling of the music world. For the next decade, Lucky continued to produce hugely popular reggae albums and won local and international awards. He also tried his hand at acting during this time and appeared in 3 movies.
By October 2007, Lucky had 7 children with his wife Sanele, and his youngest child was just 3 months old. Although he had done well for himself financially, he wasn't a very flashy man, but he invested in a Chrysler C200, which was his pride and joy. On the 18th of October 2007, 2 of Lucky's children had asked to be dropped off at their uncle's house in Rosettenville, and all 3 got into the Chrysler and set off. Lucky pulled into the driveway and his children got out and walked toward the house. He waited in the driveway for them to be safely inside, and suddenly a car pulled up and multiple men surrounded the Chrysler. 2 gunshots went off and Lucky threw the car into reverse and tried to drive away but crashed into a tree nearby. He died from gunshot wounds before paramedics could arrive on the scene. And Hestelle, I think you remember hearing about this case while you were driving to work the next morning.
Indeed, I was actually driving to work early the Friday morning when I heard over the radio that Lucky Dube had been shot and killed. So I was the first person on the list to be doing post-mortem examinations that morning, so I knew then already that I would most probably be doing his post-mortem. when I arrived, I actually expected that there would be more people around and in the mortuary because this was such a high-profile death, if one wanted to term it that. But it was actually quite quiet around there. So what was nice was that I could go about doing my work in a rather undisturbed manner. What I remember distinctly is that Mr. Dube was dressed like one would have expected from a person just dropping off their children, in a pair of jeans, shirt, socks, shoes, underpants. His hair was also styled in dreadlocks the same way that it always looked on the photos I've seen of him. By that time I knew that Mr. Dube had sustained bullet wounds, and a vital part of understanding the trajectory of a bullet inside and outside the body is actually seeing where it entered through the clothing, if possible and if applicable. So I examined the clothing to see if there were any defects in the clothing and whether it corresponded to the wounds on the body in terms of the number and the location thereof. Because sometimes a gunshot wound would go through the clothing but not necessarily into the body. In this case, there were 2 defects within a blood-stained area in the shirt and a single defect, again with blood surrounding this defect in his jeans. The wounds on the body corresponded to those defects in the clothing, and it showed 2 entrance wounds in the back and a single exit wound on the right buttock. So what I did was to remove the clothing, and we then sealed it in an evidence bag and submitted that as evidence, which is incredibly important. So that told me that there was a bullet somewhere in the body because one of the wound tracks entered and didn't exit, and that the other bullet should be either somewhere in the car or even in the vicinity of where the car was, because this gunshot wound went right through the body. So if we look at gunshot wounds, an entrance gunshot wound is usually smaller than the exit gunshot wound. It's a clear-cut circular or elliptical wound, depending on the angle with which the body is struck, and then surrounded by what we call a collar of abrasion. It's a ring around the wound where the skin is basically scraped off, and that's done by the bullet entering the body. So that tells us that it is an entrance wound. There could also be other stigmata that can assist us with determining range, but this might be absent if the victim was clothed or if he was shot through an intermediate object, such as in this case. An exit gunshot wound, on the other hand, is typically more irregular and lacerated, and that's due to the fact that the bullet has now lost a large amount of its kinetic energy. It was given off to the tissue which it damaged, and now the bullet might be tumbling, it's traveling slower, and it might actually even have struck an intermediate object or even bone. And this is exactly what happened in this case. The bullets had actually gone through the chair. After examining the wounds on the surface of the body, the organs need to be removed in order to determine the trajectory of the bullet in the body, and then to determine what damage has occurred to the internal organs. Now, this can be extremely difficult as a bullet tends to take the path of least resistance, not necessarily the straightest line. So the other problem is that the body is now lying flat, which is usually not the position in which the person was when they were shot. So one needs to try and put the body in a more or less position which you can try and repeat whatever was present at the time of the gunshot wound. In this case, both wound tracks had a similar direction, forwards, downwards, and to the right. And of the 2 wound tracks, it was the perforating gunshot wound. So that's the track that travels right through the body, which was the fatal track. This wound track entered the abdominal cavity. It damaged the bowel and its attachments, and it critically perforated. It went right through the left internal iliac artery and vein, which are massively large blood vessels in the pelvis. The wound track also ruptured Mr. Dube's bladder before exiting the body. So this bullet wound would not have been survivable under most circumstances, because the perforation of the iliac artery and vein meant that blood was immediately starting to fill the abdomen. And Mr. Dube would sadly have bled to death internally relatively quickly. In fact, when I did the post-mortem examination, there was 1,800 milliliters of blood in the abdominal cavity, which corresponds to around about 36% of the circulating blood volume of the average male person. This is absolutely catastrophic blood loss. The other wound track, of which we found the bullet in the buttock, proved to be non-fatal, and it didn't even involve any major structures.
What we know is at the scene of Lucky's murder, evidence was recovered that would end up being pivotal to this case. 9mm cartridges were found at the scene, and forensic technicians also found fingerprints in several locations, including on the roof of the car above the driver's door and on the door itself. Inside Lucky's car, police found fingerprints on the back of the driver's seat, bullet holes through the seat, and they recovered the bullets that had exited Lucky's body. The 3 sets of fingerprints were all from different individuals. One man had yanked open Lucky's door, another had leaned in, resting his hand on top of the roof of the car as he did so, and a third man had gotten into the car behind Lucky. The bullet holes had gone through the back seat and into Lucky's body, so they were likely fired by the man sitting behind him. This all lined up with what Lucky's traumatized children were able to tell police, in that they had seen 3 men around their father's car, and they'd also believed there was a 4th man in the hijacker's vehicle as well, and this was likely the getaway driver.
Police then ran the fingerprints they had found on the scene through a database of convicted offenders, and the fingerprints from the top of the car came back to an individual named Thabo Maropeng. Police hit 2 residences registered to Maropeng and found the VW Polo that had been used in the crime. Maropeng's wife told police where they could find her husband, and soon he and one of his cohorts, Sifiso Mhlanga, were under arrest. A 9mm handgun was also found, and although Sifiso and Thabo were not willing to talk initially, Thabo's wife gave police a lot of information about the movements of her husband and 3 other men on the night Lucky Dube had been murdered.
It would emerge that Thabo Maropeng, Sifiso Mhlanga, Ludwig Moe, and Mbuti Mabe were career criminals, and they hijacked people regularly. At that time, they had a Chrysler on their list as a target vehicle, and it had been pure horrible chance that they had seen Lucky in his Chrysler that night. They'd had no idea it was Lucky Dube they were hijacking, and they claimed that they were horrified when they discovered his identity after the fact, because they knew that police would not stop until they were arrested for the high-profile murder. Sifiso Mhlanga had been armed with a 9mm weapon that night, and he had fired the shots that killed Lucky. All 4 men were charged with murder and aggravated robbery, as well as other firearms charges. Thabo Maropeng decided to cut a deal with the state in exchange for immunity from prosecution, and he testified against the other 3 men.
I testified in court to my findings at autopsy, and I was quite surprised by how quick the cross-examination by the defense was. There were no real issues which were in dispute in terms of my examination. The evidence mounted and all 3 accused seemed headed one way. During the trial, Sifiso Mhlanga and Mbuti Mabe attempted to escape, but thankfully their attempt was thwarted and the men were placed under heavy guard for the rest of the trial. In April 2009, all 3 men would be found guilty of the murder of Lucky Dube, as well as all other charges against them. Later that month, life sentences were handed down to all 3.